Well, some of you may have been engaged in this pretty heavily, but the last few days was the NFL draft. And some of you, that may be the first time you've heard that the draft was the last few days, and so you don't really care. And I can't say I watched any of it. Some of you may have watched the whole thing and been really engaged and been really excited for your team and their picks or whatever that may be. But as I was just thinking about the NFL draft, no matter how old we get, we still want to be chosen. We want to be picked. When kids get together and they decide to play some type of game and organize it on their own, a typical way that they'll structure it is that they'll identify two captains, and then those captains choose teams. Somehow the captains decide who picks first. And the first captain picks, and then the second captain picks. And there's different variations. Sometimes you just go back and forth. I'm in favor of the variation where the first captain gets one pick, the second captain gets two picks, the first captain gets two picks, and you go back and forth like that. But whenever we're in those types of settings, we have two things that we want when I'm waiting to be chosen. The first thing is I want to be chosen early. Right, that adds validation to me. Nobody wants to be last, that's for sure, but everyone wants to be chosen somewhat early, so it shows them that they're worth something. But we also want to be chosen on the team that wins. We want to be chosen early, but we also want to be chosen on the team that wins. And so there's strategy involved with the captains and strategy that you're hoping for if you're waiting to be picked. Well, on my college baseball team, we have a fall season, and colleges do that. And when I was playing, it was basically just 8 weeks of practice. We'd play the community college in town a few times, but really that was it. So at the end of the fall, we would have what we called the World Series. And so we'd split up into two teams, and we'd play a 5-game series, best of 5. And there was always some type of friendly wager involved. I remember one year, the losing team had to serve the winning team in the cafeteria and had to get all dressed up in formal type wear. And it was really, really humorous. Oh, side note, I do want the record to state that in 4 years, I was always on the winning team in the World Series. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so my senior year, the coach allowed seniors to help pick teams. And so we got to draft the teams. And it was real interesting and real fun. Made a whole night of it. And there were certain restrictions and requirements that the coach imposed. One of them is that certain players were paired with other players. So we had two main catchers on the team. And so if one team chose one catcher, the other team automatically would receive the other catcher. And part of it is the coach wanted us to have fun, but also be productive and not hurt ourselves as well. And so we had this extra layer of strategy involved. Because we can take the catchers, for example. Let's assume that the catchers were about the same skill level. So if they're the same skill level, there was no reason for me to waste an early pick on one of the catchers, because I knew I wasn't going to get much of an advantage by doing that. But if there was a discrepancy between the skills of the catchers, then, maybe I use an early pick because I know I'm going to have an advantage in that particular area. And so we went back and forth, and again, my team won. But it's one of those things where whether we're talking about the NFL draft, whether we're talking about kids getting together and choosing teams, or this World Series that my college baseball team played, we like to be chosen. But here's a great news. God has chosen you. Not somebody else, not the person next to you, not the person you think has more talent than you. God has chosen you. And one of the things that we just have to wrap our mind around, and it can be difficult, is the fact that the imperfect God works through imperfect people. Works through you. He works through me. We're not perfect. We have flaws. We have things that hold us back, but God works through us. And so we come to 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 9. And Peter writes, "For you are a chosen people. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's very own possession." Once you were not a people, but now you are a people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for He called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. So we have this priesthood imagery that Peter provides. And when we're talking about, when Peter's writing in the first century, we still have the Jewish system of priesthood that is ingrained in the people's mind. See, for the Jews, the priest was the intermediary between them and God. So in order to get to God, the people had to go through the priest. The priest was the one who would offer the sacrifices. The priest was the one who would do all these rituals to assure that they were done properly and that the law was upheld. But we find that Jesus changes this. Jesus is now our high priest, but we also recognize that Jesus is God. And so we go to Jesus, who is God. And so we all have direct access to God. So we are part of the priesthood of all believers. Now, this isn't to devalue spiritual leaders or clergy or those types of things, because spiritual leaders can be those who are ordained as a clergy member, or they could just be a friend or a mentor. We need those people. We need people in our lives who can invest in us and challenge us and help us to grow spiritually. But through Jesus Christ, we all have direct access to God. We don't have to go through anybody else. You can go directly to Jesus Christ. And part of also what Jesus does is He purchased us. We belong to Jesus. We are now God's. Now, God created us. And so, on some level, we recognize that we all belong to God regardless. But through Jesus Christ, we can now be restored to have a right relationship with God. See, before Jesus came and sacrificed Himself and atoned for our sins, we were estranged from God. We were enemies of God. We were running after our sinful desires, but Jesus can save us and forgive us from our sins. He purchased us through His crucifixion. But the requirement is that we also die with Christ. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, the Apostle Paul writes, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this life by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me." So we died with Christ. When we accepted the forgiveness that Jesus provided, it meant that we died to our sinful nature. We died to the things we want that are contrary to God, and now we live in Jesus Christ. And through this, we can be free, as Paul also writes in Romans chapter 6, verse 18. "Now you are free from your slavery to sin, and you have become slaves to righteous living." We're no longer slaves to sin. We're no longer obligated to the sinful nature. We have been set free because of the atoning work of Jesus Christ. And so now we belong to God. We are His chosen people, and we can live according to Him. See, before Jesus, we were living in darkness. We were living in a world full of our sin and suffering and pain and choices that were contrary to God. Now, this is not to say that the life you were living was morally bad. You may have been a morally good person, but until Jesus Christ comes into our lives, we are living in darkness. We're living contrary to God and doing things that are contrary to Him. But I fear what happens a lot of times is that we come to know Jesus and we have this great experience and we're on fire for Him and we're growing and working towards Him. But, then we start making little compromises and we drift and we drift and we drift. See, darkness and light are in complete contrast to each other. When we first came to know Jesus, our eyes had to adjust. It was difficult. It was blinding at times, but we knew it was good. But too many times we start drifting away, and it gets darker and darker and darker. And when we go slow enough, our eyes adjust so we can still see, or at least we still think we can see, until we've walked down a path that's not where Jesus wants us to go. Jesus has called us into light, and so we need to make sure that we continually work to stay in the light. That's why we need each other. Once we were not a people, but now we are God's people. We belong to Him. So on some level, we have this concept that God has organized us. He unites us. He's gotten us together and said, this is the direction you should go. So when we talk about making sure we don't drift into darkness, we have each other to help us do that. We have each other to make sure that we don't get away from where God wants us to be. Because we can easily wander. We can easily drift. And so our imperfections rise to the surface more often than we would like. But we're reminded that the perfect God works through imperfect people. See, God chose you. Not by accident. He intentionally chose you. You are part of God's plan. But one of the things that we have believed that's a lie from society is that our religion, our faith, our belief in God should be private. That nobody else should know about it. We shouldn't talk about it. We don't talk about religion or politics, right? We're not called to live in isolation. We're called to live in community. And community can be seen in many different ways. It can be seen when we physically gather. It can be seen when we interact online or through phone calls or through letters or emails. You know, when we're together, when we're communicating, when we're working back and forth, we are the people of God. And so as such, we are called to do His work. God did not make you His people just so we could feel entitled. Just so we could say, well, I'm part of God's family. And feel pretty proud about ourselves. God made you His people so that we could do His work. And through that, He displays His mercy on us. Now, the concepts of mercy and grace are always really intriguing to me because they mean kind of different things. Mercy can be defined as not getting what we deserve. So I deserve punishment. I deserve condemnation. And by God's mercy, He does not extend that to me. Instead, He extends grace. And grace is God giving us something we don't deserve. He gives us salvation. He gives us freedom. He gives us victory. We don't deserve it, but God gives it to us. And through Jesus, we can have this assurance that there is no condemnation. See, the Apostle Paul again writes in Romans 8, chapter 1 and 2, "So now there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. And because you belong to Him, the power of the life-giving Spirit has freed you from the power of sin that leads to death." You know, you're not perfect. The perfect God works through imperfect people. You're not perfect. God's grace covers you. We don't have to live in fear. God is not the person with the magnifying glass trying to burn the ants, waiting for us to mess up. He has covered us in His mercy and grace and has welcomed us into His family. And through Jesus Christ, we can be free from condemnation. He frees us from sin. And He calls us to live a new and a glorious life. But this life can be a little strange. It can be different. It can make people uncomfortable because it's contrary to what the world, it's what we call countercultural. Jesus calls us to live a certain way that's against what the world says we should do. Now, this is not in a way that's hostile towards the world, but in a way that shows love and grace and humility that the world doesn't understand. See, Peter continues in verse 11. He says, "I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. So Peter tells us that we are temporary residents or foreigners or aliens in this very world. Now, remember, we still have a very Jewish understanding of the world and God's family and his people and all those types of things. The nation of Israel had a very exclusive view of the people of God. Those who were not part of Israel, who were not of Jewish descent from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were outsiders. They were foreigners. Now, there are examples in the Old Testament where someone who is a foreigner comes in and becomes a part of the family of God, and we see God's grace in the Old Testament. But those stories are few and far between, and Israel is seen as more of an exclusive group. Now, Jesus makes it so the family of God is no longer an exclusive group. We're not excluding people, we're welcoming people. Now, they have to be crucified with Christ. They have to ask him for forgiveness. They have to actually seek forgiveness from Jesus. But Jesus invites us all to participate in the family of God. And when we do that, when we accept the forgiveness that Jesus provides and live the way he calls us to live, we're going to be strange. We're going to be different. We're going to look different from before Christ to after Christ. Once Jesus comes and saves me and redeems me, I should look different. And again, this is countercultural. So I have this book here. It's a good book. It's called Weird Because Normal Isn't Working. It's by author Craig Groeschel. And the premise of the book is that there are people who try to live the Christian life without allowing Jesus to transform them. And so they continue to live dissatisfied lives. They struggle time after time. And Groeschel says it's because Jesus isn't Lord of everything in your life. See, we're too worried about fitting in, about looking the part, of making sure we don't look weird, that we're not allowing Jesus to be Lord of our life. And that's part of the battle. That's part of the war that Peter is talking about. Sin wages war against our souls. Sin doesn't want us to live the righteous life that Jesus calls us to live. Satan is working against us so that we are continually pulled and tempted back into darkness. So wars and battles are vicious events. People who have endured them are changed. And that is the seriousness in which we should take the spiritual battle that we are fighting against sin and darkness and evil in our lives. We are wise not to take it lightly. Because one of the things that we have to make sure we recognize and we affirm is that being saved by Jesus is not the end of our spiritual journey. It begins it. Too many people stop, well, I asked Jesus into my heart and that was it. Well, we got to keep moving. We got to keep going. We've got to die with Jesus. Now, this doesn't mean we should be paranoid. Romans 5:20, Paul writes, but where sin increased, grace increased all the more. That's great news. See, no matter how sinful we are, no matter how deep in the depths of despair we feel we have sunk, God's grace can reach us. He can save us. But Paul continues, if we stop there at Romans 5:20, it means, well, we can do whatever we want. But in 6:1 and 2, Paul writes, well then, should we keep on sinning so grace can increase? Of course not. Since we have died to sin, how can we live in it any longer? If we have been crucified with Jesus, then our sinful life is dead and we can live to Jesus. We are no longer obligated to the sinful life. We can live righteously. But part of what we understand here is we don't have to live anxious lives. We don't have to live lives where we're just worrying all the time. We can have this thing called assurance that God's grace is working in and through this. But it's important that we don't neglect the people of God, those other people who are following Jesus, because they can make sure we're staying in the light and not drifting into the darkness. Because it can be real easy and tempting to justify our actions and say, well, I'm living this way and this is what Jesus wants me to do, and so we've justified it, so we feel good about it. Because belief in Jesus moves us to act. It calls us to do something. It produces things in our life. In Galatians 5:13, Paul again writes, "For you have been called to live in freedom, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love." Jesus Christ has set us free. He has welcomed us in to the people of God. He's given us God's mercy. He has called us to live this life that's a foreigner, that's an outsider, so that people are drawn to Him. And so as such, we need to use the love of Jesus Christ that's in us to show others the love of Jesus Christ so that they might be able to experience His saving grace like we have experienced. But this freedom that we have in Jesus Christ does not give us the leeway to do whatever we want. It does not throw standards out the window. In fact, I would argue that the freedom Jesus provides raises the standards, makes the expectations even greater. Because we're not following a list of rules, we're following the love that Jesus Christ has put in us. So as the church, as the people of God, we are called to do good. You are the church, not somebody else. You, sitting there in your living room, in your kitchen, your bedroom, in your car, wherever you are the church. And even though you're imperfect, we see that the perfect God uses and works through imperfect people. Now, I don't know what you're going through right now. I don't know the life you're living. I don't know the choices you've made. I don't know the choices that you are forced to make now. I don't know the predicaments you find yourself in, your financial situation, your health situation. I don't know any of that. But I do know that Jesus Christ has given us all the grace that we could ever need. We just have to live in that grace. Too many times, we don't. We neglect it. We do our own thing. We try to live our own way. And we don't live in the grace that Jesus has given us. See, when we live in the grace that Jesus has given us, then we glorify God and people see God through us. The point is not for you to feel better about yourself. The point is not for you to look better than other people. The point is for people to be drawn to Jesus through you. Because I believe Jesus Christ has saved me from my sins. And as such, I want other people to experience that as well. I want you to experience that as well if you haven't. Because Jesus Christ is ready to save you. So there should be an urgency in our actions. Whatever we do, wherever we're going, there should be an urgency. Not as though we're panicked, not as though we're running around like a chicken with our head cut off, but in a way that we recognize that without me, somebody might not know Jesus. See, I would argue you are chosen for this moment. You're not chosen just when how things used to be. You're not chosen for when things get back to normal. If you're waiting for that, then you're missing the opportunities that Jesus has given you. You are a chosen people. You are the church. And as such, the church is called to impact the world with the love and message of Jesus Christ. And we can do that wherever we are. No matter the means, no matter the situation, we are called to impact the world with the love and message of Jesus Christ. Because you, as an imperfect person, was chosen by the perfect God to be His people. The perfect God works through imperfect people. But too many times we stop short in our spiritual journey. Well, that's good enough. I put forth enough effort. See, when you were crucified with Jesus, you died. Your sinful desires died. And now Jesus is living in you. So I asked you the question, how do your actions show that Jesus is living in you? Because you are the church. You are a chosen people. You are God's holy people. And we are called to impact the world with the love and message of Jesus Christ, here and now.